Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I'm at Tim's wonderful set, so must be Q&A time. Tim says we have a lot of questions lined up, so without wasting any more time, let's go get into them. Okay, first question here from a Discord member. It's Mr. Bellend again. I noticed that in your Resident Evil 2 optimization guide, you noticed that none of the AI options were particularly good. This is for Tim. So why is it that in some games, settings such as SMMA look great, and in others, they can make the game look terrible? So tell us, Tim.
Yeah, well, I can't say I'm a game development expert, so I guess this is just based on what I've seen across a number of games. It's the main culprit for AA techniques looking bad seems to be TAA, or temporal anti-aliasing, and there just seems to be a range of ways that different developers implement that technique into their games. So for a game like Resident Evil 2, their implementation is pretty soft, pretty blurry, does a lot of smoothing. So obviously that's the style that they wanted and liked in their game, so that's what they chose to implement. A game like Battlefield 5 or Shadow of the Tomb Raider, they also use TAA, but it's a little bit different. There's obviously different parameters you can tweak with each of these anti-aliasing techniques. So in those games, it looks a lot sharper, and obviously they put a bit more time into developing those techniques. As for SMAA, that's a little bit different in the way that it tries to sharpen and preserve detail compared to anti-aliasing, because you want both of those techniques preserved. And yeah, it just depends. In some games, there's a lot of sort of shimmering effects that you can get with the way that they implement, alpha effects and that sort of thing. The different textures that can all sort of trigger the sort of shimmering that you might get in a game like Resident Evil 2 with SMAA. So it just depends on the assets that they're using across the game with those techniques as to whether SMAA looks good or whether it looks bad. So yeah, it's a real game-by-game basis as to what is the best anti-aliasing technique for a given game. I think it's safe to say that if you can super sample a game, that's still the best technique that we've got. Okay, good question for you here, Steve, from our Discord chat. Can you explain in further detail the difference between allocated memory and memory usage as it related to VRAM? Probably about the whole 6 gigabyte thing with the
I covered it briefly. I probably can't go into it really in too much more detail here for the Q&A. I would have to research all the correct terminology and everything that's going on. But in short, allocation is what the game, it is aware of the resources it has available, and then it will allocate according to what it thinks it needs. And the advantage of allocating more than what it's currently using, or exactly what it needs, is that it ensures that those resources will be available if need be, so you don't run into things like stuttering and whatnot. And then usage, which we can't actually measure at all. There's no possible way with the tools that we have available or any of the other tech media to measure current exact memory usage. So we have to sort of do that. It's guesswork by if there's any missing or blurred textures, if there's stuttering on a 6 gigabyte card opposed to an 8 gigabyte card. So we can really only measure allocation. That's where a huge amount of confusion comes in, because a new game will come out and certain games will allocate everything, like the Call of Duty series does that with most settings. And then some games are quite conservative with what they allocate. They seem to allocate pretty close to what the usage will actually be. But when a new game comes out and it allocates loads and loads of memory, people think that's justification for needing 8 gigabytes, 10 gigabytes, or whatever it may happen to be. But as I found in my recent exploration video, looking at the 6 gigabyte VRAM buffer and then comparing that to, I think it was an 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer.
Yeah.
At the moment, especially for 1440p with your HD texture packs and things like that, 6 gigabytes does seem to be perfectly fine. But when that will change, I don't know. It probably won't be too far into the future. But you hinted at that's probably going to relate to console memory buffers and things like that before we see a mainstream usage push over 6 gigabytes. But yeah, I can't get into too much detail on that one. I would have to do a lot of research to bring you an accurate content piece on that, but hopefully that helps anyway. Okay, on the subject of VRAM, another question here, basically asking in terms of VRAM requirements, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. So do the GPU manufacturers increase the VRAM first and then the games start using more VRAM, or is it the games that sort of push the manufacturers, the developers of the games, push them to add more VRAM to the cards? It's kind of like a natural progression of things. It probably depends on a whole host of things, like how much memory costs to add. Like, does it make sense to do a doubling of memory? So that's probably one thing. But obviously, the hardware has to be there for the game developers to use that much memory. There's no point making a texture pack that nobody can run at more than 1 frame per second.
Yeah, I think, hardware manufacturers would look at the trends and sort of see where games are going. If they're making 8 gigabyte cards and current games using 7 gigabytes out of the 8 gigabytes, then there would be that incentive to maybe bump that up to 12 for the next generation.
Yeah.
So I think, it's kind of both. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it's definitely both.
All right, another question from our Discord chat here. The Vega 64 I had was improved greatly by undervolting. It used less power and therefore ran cooler. It sounds like undervolting on Radeon 7 still produces good results, so the problem has not been fixed. AMD know that undervolting is a valid tweaking option as they provide the undervolting options in their general drivers. So the question is, why aren't the cards tuned to these lower voltages? They've put money into cooling solutions to deal with the higher voltages and heat. There must be a reason for this. It's very confusing.
There is a reason. The reason is that they have evaluated what specifications the cards can run at what voltages. So they'll have a frequency range a frequency they want to achieve and a range they want the card to run in, and then what voltage is required for, a wide amount or a good amount of the cards to work with. So it just improves yield. So basically, if they want to make the voltage tolerance is really low, or really tight rather, then the yields will be a lot worse because there'll be a much smaller percentage of the silicon that will be able to achieve that. And so as an example, like Vega 64 you gave, I had a Vega 64 card that undervolted amazingly well, like as best as the best sort of result you can expect to get out of those cards. And I had one that was terrible. You undervolted it just ever so slightly and it just started crashing. So that's why Radeon 7 can be undervolted. It's a form of overclocking, really. So you can undervolt some cards and get good results and make them much more efficient. But they can't do it for all of them because then a percentage, I have no idea what the percentage is, but it would be a reasonably large percentage of them would have stability issues. So it's not, it's frustrating that I suppose some cards do undervolt really well and look great. But AMD would have to have a much tighter binning process, I suppose. So there'd have to be a card that runs at lower frequencies or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same with overclocking. People wonder, a lot of manufacturers release their factory overclock cards. Why isn't the reference model just the same as the factory overclock? It's pretty much for the same reason.
Yep.
You can only do so much with the silicon in terms of yield, so they need to keep the tolerances nice and large.
Yeah, because people think it's an under type thing. It's not like overclocking.
Yeah.
But it's very much the same thing. You're running the card out of spec. So it's that simple. Okay, Mitch has a question here. Do you think the GTX 1660 Ti, and then I suppose the supposed possibly being released 1660 and 1650 is Nvidia's attempt at upstaging Navi? I think really they just did it because they need to get more competitive at those price points and they wanted to do it with Turing. They obviously didn't want to keep doing it with older Pascal GPUs. So that's really why they did it. They still have to compete with themselves. So the GTX 1060 wasn't selling great, so it was time to move on. And obviously they do have to update those product lines because at some point AMD will come to the party with newer, more efficient, better products. So, any other thoughts on that one?
No, I think you summarized that one pretty well.
Right, let's move on. Okay, when it comes to frame time or VR, which we don't test, you do any VR?
No VR stuff.
We can only talk about the frame time stuff then. How do you guys find the GTX, the Pascal and Turing cards, and then Vega and the Radeon 7? I keep hearing owners of AMD GPUs saying the gameplay seemed smoother on their HBM memoried cards versus Nvidia cards. Any personal experience or thoughts with that one? Well, we probably can talk to that a bit because I personally game with a Vega 56 card. Reason for that is I had a spare one. So I don't want to be taking the GPU out of my personal system, so I usually just use whatever's spare, no matter how low end or high end that may be. In this case, it was Vega 56. I had 2 of those, so I'm using that. And really, I don't buy into it at all. Like, there's some games where the Radeon GPUs, the frame time performance isn't that good. There's other games where the Turing GPUs aren't very good. But for the most part, they're both very good in all games. So,
Yeah, I think that this whole frame time thing came from way back when AMD GPUs had a lot of issues with crossfire frame pacing.
They had issues with single cards, but
And then
in particular crossfire.
Yeah, and then they spent a lot of time improving that performance. So then maybe for a time people thought that it was better than Nvidia cards, but certainly, as you've said and what I've experienced myself as well, there's really no significant difference. It can vary title to title, but overall, I think both cards pretty much as smooth as one another.
A couple of people complained with the Radeon 7 content saying that I use the average frame rates for showing the percentage differences between cards and for working out the cost per frame. Truth is, if you take the average 1% low result across all the games, you end up with the same figures. So, there'll be some games where, the AMD GPUs might be a teeny tiny bit smoother if you're very sensitive to that, and then vice versa with the GeForce GPUs.
This is an interesting question from Silence Game in our Discord community. What do you guys expect games to look like in 5 years? It's often tough to tell with 100% certainty which game is 2013 to 2014 and which game is 2018 to 2019. I think back in the day, everyone without hesitation could tell which game is from 1997 and which is from 2002. Like with a lot of things, there's going to be diminishing returns over a certain point. When you get really good quality textures, really good quality geometry, really good quality lighting, there's fewer and fewer things you can improve in a game to get better, visual quality or differences between each generation. Personally, I probably could tell the difference between 2013 games and 2019. Like if you look back on a game from 5 years ago now, there's some telltale signs like lower quality lighting.
I think for the most part, yes, there is. But there are some games that have been rehashed 1 or 2 or 3 times too many.
Like Assassin's Creed or...
even like we saw with Just Cause 4, like a lot of the effects went massively backwards from the previous installment. So that was disappointing to see. I think, just me touching on this question quickly, I think back then, computer hardware, graphics cards were moving so quickly. Whereas now that's, as we've seen since, 22 nanometer or something, that the new significant gains, especially from the mid-range, the mainstream users, it's coming much slower. So you are seeing that sort of 5 years of gradual, very slight tweaks to the graphics.
Yeah. The main question here was, what do you guys expect games to look like in 5 years? I think there's probably a number of categories that could be improved in games. I think there's some areas that probably wouldn't be as improved as much, but certainly the one that I would look at is lighting, not quality, because I think the quality is very good at the moment, but certainly accuracy. There seems to be a move towards ray tracing, for example. In 5 years' time, that could be quite a dominant technology. So that's one thing I'd look at. I still think today, while texture quality is...
I was going to say...
Texture quality is high in some games, but it's not great in others. And I think as GPUs have more memory available to them, especially on the consoles, if the consoles increase from 8 gig to, say, 12 or 16 in the next gen, we'll start to see for 4K gaming really high quality textures. And then as well, I think a big area that I'd like to see improved is sort of not necessarily the geometry of individual items, but certainly the number of items. So the ability to have your scene feel really complete. Like in real life, when you go to someone's house, there's so many items.
Sure,
everywhere.
I think that was a cool thing about Metro Exodus.
There's really high
I haven't played a whole lot of it, but the bit I played, there was a high density of just things, objects, detail. So that really made the game look pretty amazing for me. Yeah,
so I think those are the sort of 3 things I'd like to see improved, as well as sort of on the CPU side, we might get better AI, better simulations and that sort of thing. But I'd certainly expect those 3 areas. I think things more like water quality, for example, is still very good right now. Cloth simulations. We've already got techniques to simulate hair. I think a lot of those things I wouldn't expect too many improvements on. But the other areas, I would say there's still room to grow there.
All right. Generally speaking, what monitor panel type, TN, IPS, VA, do you think provides the best balance between response time and color vibrancy? So clearly your video on this topic was not enough for Daniel. So
I guess you just want a simple answer, and that's fine. That's fine. So the best balance between response time and color vibrancy, that's probably going to be IPS. VA's the slowest in terms of response times, TN the fastest. So I think, if you want the best balance, you probably have to go IPS. VA is also a good option. That said, modern TNs as well, they're getting some good quality, TN panels. I reviewed that Viotech monitor recently that had good vibrancy. So Yeah, I think, if you're looking at that 4 to 5 millisecond range for response times and you want good colors, then you probably have to go IPS.
All right, next question. Do you consider a Ryzen 5 2600 a bottleneck for an RTX 2080 or any enthusiast upscale PC build? So basically any sort of high-end graphics card. We sort of get these questions every now and then. It really depends on the games you're playing. So we're looking at, what are we talking about there? That's 1080 Ti sort of levels of performance. That's pretty punchy GPU performance. Most games are GPU bound. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example, especially if you're running at 4K, 1440p even, I don't think it's definitely not going to be a severe bottleneck. The Ryzen 5 2600 is a great gaming processor, but it is very affordable. So the RTX 2080 is an expensive graphics card, I suppose. But you're using a Ryzen 7 processor, aren't you?
I'm using Threadripper.
Okay, I thought you were gaming on a Ryzen processor for a while.
I was, yeah.
With a 1080 Ti.
With a 1080 Ti, but I was playing at ultra wide 1440p.
Yeah. So again, very GPU bound there. Basically, the answer is no. Where the Ryzen processor is going to struggle is areas where it would struggle with any GPU. So, for example, 4v4 StarCraft 2, the Ryzen CPUs are horrible. It's an old game, maybe using 2 threads now. I think it's still single thread, and it just doesn't take advantage of any of the Ryzen instructions or anything like that. So it runs very badly. There's a couple of other old games that people have told me run badly, but any new modern demanding title, like your Battlefield 5, that'll run perfectly fine, multiplayer and all that. So no, I don't think it's really something you have to concern yourself with. I think for the most part, it'll be perfectly fine.
All right, we've got a big combo question here from one of our YouTube commenters.
Greedy on the questions.
Yeah, 4 questions. We're going to have to rapid fire these, I reckon. So are you ready, Steve?
I'll try.
Right, let's go. Do you think RTX and DLSS will be adopted by gamers? Not right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be adopted by game developers before gamers can adopt it.
Yep. Do you think I should be excited for Ryzen 3000 CPU? So should you be excited for the Ryzen 3000?
Yeah, why the hell not?
Yep. Do you think the RAM prices will go down in 2019, Q2 or Q3?
I thought they already had started to go down significantly.
Yeah, they've definitely been dropping. So
yeah, I don't think they're going to drop much more significantly, but they'll probably tend to do that before DDR5 comes, and DDR4 will probably pick up a little bit as production stops.
And the final one here, do you think that Navi will compete with RTX graphics cards? I mean, surely it will compete with one of them at least.
You would hope so, yeah.
Hard to say though.
Yeah.
Okay, good question here from one of our YouTube commenters. In the used market, I see a lot of people selling their old Intel CPUs for a lot of money. The i7 4790K is still selling above 200 euros on average, while the Ryzen 5 2600 new is only 170 euros. Why do people think their old CPUs are worth so much?
Well, because they are. Like, if they're selling them for that much, if they're listing them for that much and they're selling for that much, they're worth that much. But there's multiple reasons for why that is. One of them is people buy or have an older Intel system with that platform, and maybe they bought it with a Core i3 or a Pentium or whatever, and they want to upgrade. And it's much cheaper for them to spend $200 or 200 euros on 4790K than it is to build a whole new Ryzen or modern Intel systems. That's why they do that. So that's generally why you can ask so much for those CPUs, because it is still cheaper for someone. Another reason, which is going to be an unpopular opinion, but it is true, the i7 4790K for most games, particularly older games, we had a question where I mentioned StarCraft earlier, the Intel processor is still going to perform better than a Ryzen 5 2600. And a lot of people use that information to bag the Ryzen 5 processor and say how garbage Ryzen is because older Intel CPUs, like this Haswell-based Core i7 that we're talking about, is faster for gaming. But from Haswell all the way up to Coffee Lake, the increases in IPC have been very, very small. The increases in frequency have also been very, very small. So it's not an old, ancient, rubbish CPU architecture from Intel. Haswell's still very good. Intel hasn't made many steps since then. It's still a quad core with 8 threads, so it still plays all the latest games without a problem. And like I said, it's faster than most of the Ryzen lineup. But the reason why I recommend you buy a Ryzen 5 2600, if you don't have an old Intel system and you're looking at building a new computer and you're like, oh, for similar money I can get a used Intel system, or do I buy a Ryzen system? I highly recommend you don't bother with the used stuff for all the obvious pitfalls that come with buying used hardware. And the Ryzen 5 2600 is plenty fast. As we said, it'll get the most out of just about every GPU you can afford if you're looking at buying secondhand hardware. And it has all modern platform features. So it's got native USB 3.1 and all that kind of stuff, new hardware, warranty, and you'll be able to upgrade it to the Ryzen 3000 series later in the year. So it's got a good upgrade path. It's not a dead platform. You've got room to upgrade without having to try and buy higher end processors for exorbitant prices. Or exuberant prices rather. Sorry about that. Okay, that concludes part 1 of this month's Q&A. Good job picking the questions and good job asking the questions. Very good questions this month. It was a lot of fun, and I'm keen to go get into part 2.
Steve, silence your phone for the Q&A videos, mate. What are you doing?
Moving along. Like, subscribe, share, follow us on Patreon. We're very professional. I'll start again.
No, we got to use that. Come on, you can't back out now out of our outro.
Okay. Yeah. So, like, subscribe. What else do we tell people to do? They can give us money on Patreon.
They can.
If you had done that, you would have caught our live stream we just did before this. It was amazing. Can't talk highly enough.
Yeah, best live stream ever to have occurred.
Best one ever.
You'll have to wait until next month's live stream.
Yeah, because you can't go back and watch them.
No, impossible.
Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for supporting us. And I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
That's who this guy's been all this time. It's Tim. That's his name.
Never say it.
Anyway, thanks for watching. See you later.